Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Daryn, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Absolutely. No, thank you for having me. It is such a pleasure to be on this show. And, for those who don't know me, my name is Daryn Kirscht. I am an author. I've written technically a couple books, but one specifically called the Snyderverse Saga, which kind of covers the Zack Snyder DC movies and what's referred to as the DC extended universe per se, to a certain extent. But the focus is on the Zack Snyder movies per se, and kind of how that affected um, everything in terms of social media, pop culture, the behind the scenes of the movies, and how it influenced how certain movies in the future got made or didn't get made. It was just something that I was really passionate about, so I wrote a book about that. And then I also have a podcast as well called Round Two, the film sequel, where we talk about the second movie in a film franchise. And it's a lot of fun doing these deep dives into these movies. Some are great, some are not. So it makes for pretty fun conversations.
What's the worst part for you about podcasting? I find it's the editing. I've got it down to a science, I think, at this point, but even some days I slip up. I'm like, oh, the words don't match the lips.
Yeah, the recording's the most fun part. I think the hardest part is probably the editing because sometimes things don't always go as smoothly as you would like when you are recording. And then you kind of have to try to make it work sometimes. And sometimes that's really difficult. Like there was one I recorded where the other guy who I was recording this episode with was like 5 or 6 seconds behind where I was. So it was like even the recording of it was difficult, but then editing it was super difficult too. So I think that is probably the most difficult part.
I want to talk about the Snyderverse, and then we'll end up probably talking about the podcast again at some point. But with the Snyderverse, what exactly is the Snyderverse? I think people might have come across, like myself, hashtags or certain memes about it. But it really kind of like, when did it start, and then when did it really kind of take off, and how do we get this large amount of people that love Zack Snyder, then a large amount of people that just don't like the Snyderverse?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So, what is the Snyderverse? I think that's a question that most people don't have a clear answer to, because some people, like in the media, have this idea that the Snyderverse is technically all of the DC movies, like the DC EU or DC Extended Universe, as it was coined back in the day, that has all the movies. Like that includes the theatrical Justice League, that includes like the Flash movie, the Aquaman movie, Birds of Prey, all of those movies, Shazam in there, but it doesn't really include Zack Snyder's Justice League, but it kind of does in a weird way with the Flash, so it's really complicated. But I always refer to the Snyderverse as the Zack Snyder movies, and Zack himself has mentioned that his cut of Justice League, the Snyder cut of Justice League, is in an like an else world, kind of in its own. It's more in line, obviously, with Man of Steel, Batman v Superman. So it's kind of a part of that, I would say. That's what I would refer the Snyderverse to. I wouldn't even. Some people say there's like Suicide Squad is in the Snyderverse. I don't 100% believe that. I kind of do, but I kind of don't because I believe the Ayer cut of Suicide Squad would probably be in the Snyderverse. But that's another conversation as well of another movie that is out there but hasn't been released. That version of that movie, the original version of that movie, because of all the stuff that had happened with all the movies and the response to the movies and how the studio Warner Brothers reacted or overreacted, some might say, to those movies and how the fans and the critics felt about them at that point in time.
Now, how did Warner Brothers overreact to Zack Snyder's films?
Well, so when Man of Steel first came out, right? I mean, Man of Steel was like the original, the very first one, because they had just finished with the Dark Knight trilogy with Dark Knight Rises, and Nolan helped produce Man of Steel. David S. Goyer, who was one of the writers for the Dark Knight movies, he wrote the movie. So it's kind of the same creative team from the Dark Knight movies. Hans Zimmer did the score, right? And then Zack Snyder came on to direct that movie. And that movie was obviously a very different movie because Zack Snyder, for those who maybe aren't super familiar with his filmography, is known for kind of a deconstructivist approach to filmmaking, to movies, to storytelling. And so that means that he's trying to challenge certain characters in different ways and try different things than what has been done traditionally in the past. Like his point of view is, well, if somebody says that this character can't do something, what would happen if they did have to do that, what would that look like? How would they overcome that and rise above it, right?
Because most of these characters that people love are they kind of like, especially if you're a Batman or Superman fan, you create them as your gods. So your gods have things that they can't do. When it comes to like Batman doesn't kill people, well, Zack Snyder's like, what happens if I put him in a situation where Batman does have to kill somebody? And a lot of people get upset with that because that's not their idea of Batman. It's like with I think the thing with Man of Steel was that when Superman killed Zod, everyone kind of lost their mind because like, what? No, Superman doesn't kill people. And it's like, well, that's why I put him in a situation where he really didn't have a choice.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And because that was that Superman has a also has like a he doesn't kill people kind of rule. But Zach's like, well, that's kind of more of a thing with the movies. And like he was pretending like the movies didn't even exist. He was focused solely on like the comic books and kind of and obviously he's very inspired by very darkish in nature comic books like The Dark Knight Returns, for example, an older war-weary Bruce Wayne Batman, where he is a lot more like ruthless and he's more of a brawler in that story. He's tortured by some of the demons of his past, like Robin dying, right? So that's and obviously he adapted Watchmen from Frank Miller, which is maybe the most famous graphic novel ever, and is also a very deconstructivist kind of story about the fall of the Watchmen, right? And so I think, and that's also a great movie too. I love that movie.
I think that movie was probably the start of when we started seeing more of the grittier superheroes, the ones where the more realistic stuff like Watchmen. I watched that on pay-per-view as a family movie, and I didn't know what it was about. I just thought it was
Oh,
a
oh
superhero
wow.
film. And I was probably what, like 12 when it came out or something like that. And I just remember my brother looking over at me when the Dr. Manhattan comes on screen. He's got you know, his Dr. Manhattan showing, and you get this point where my brother was like, "Good movie pick, Robbie. Good pick." And I was like, "Oh, damn it! I didn't know this was going to be because you just see superheroes on the front. I expected to be like everything, how we've always seen superhero movies, but it really changed the game."
It really did. It changed the perception of what superhero movies could be. And I think part of that started with, Christopher Nolan's Batman movies, with The Dark Knight, especially, I would say that one really kind of had an impact for sure. Obviously, the Marvel movies had an impact too, in terms of like you mentioned, like the more family-oriented nature of the movies. They can be for kids, teenagers, adults, nerds. So I think that was a big part of it too. But yeah, Watchmen really was kind of, Christopher Nolan said it was ahead of its time, because it was a movie that it wasn't received very well because at that time, it was just kind of not, it wasn't received very well because it was a very unsettling kind of movie. It wasn't like a feel good, technically kind of movie. But yeah, I really started there and really kind of, and obviously, I mean, Man of Steel was, sure controversial, but a lot of people still really like Man of Steel. It was Batman v Superman where people really kind of started uh, this kind of like love-hate relationship with Zack Snyder and his movies, especially that one.
Why do you feel Batman versus Superman was kind of like the point that really kind of divided people? Was it just because you're pinning up two forces that people would never think would ever go against each other, but honestly work together? Because we always think of a winner and a loser in a battle. So if you're, that's like pinning up Pepsi versus Coke. I mean, everyone's got a side in that fight, but no, there's not really a clear winner or loser. So when you have these two going against each other, people are very defensive over their idols.
Yeah, that's true. And I think when it comes to that movie, there's a couple different things that come into play. The first, obviously, being that this is supposed to set up its own like movie universe because Marvel had clearly already done this, right? With the Avengers movies and all the solo movies before that. And Warner Brothers is like, hey, we have this incredible pantheon of superhero characters from DC Comics, right? And we have a Superman movie, and it was fairly successful. It was financially successful. And sure, it might not have made $1 billion, but it still made in the upper 600 million range. It made a profit. Sure, it was somewhat controversial. Some people loved it. Some people really didn't like it because it went against what a lot of other Superman stories have been with the mythology. So, with that movie, I was setting up a universe. You're introducing a lot of new characters, but characters who, when the casting announcements were made, were not met with a lot of praise, which means absolutely nothing to me because it's like you haven't seen what they're going to look like, how they're going to act. we don't know. I mean, sure. I mean, Jesse Eisenberg, Gal Gadot, Ben Affleck, all these castings just kind of had fans of the characters kind of like, what is he doing? Like, what are they going with this? So then, yeah, and then of course, they're setting up a universe. You think it's kind of a, but then at the same time, with some of the events that happen in that movie, it's a very dark movie, you know. So I think that was also part of it as well. It wasn't what people were expecting out of a superhero movie, especially like you think of all these characters and it's Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, right? So it's supposed to be like setting up the Justice League. But then, you have, spoiler alert, one of the characters dies in that movie. And that's like, it doesn't really, it kind of felt like, how are they setting up a universe this way? But obviously, when you see Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League, it makes a ton of sense because they're kind of like a part one and part two movies per se. But I think it's part of that. And it's also part just kind of how Hollywood was at the time. Like I mentioned, Marvel had the Avengers movies, right? By this time, they already had two Avengers movies out, and multiple, solo movies for a lot of their characters. They were building up this really big cohesive universe that has never really been done before or since, I would say. And then you obviously Star Wars was back with The Force Awakens. The Harry Potter franchise was being, brought back with the Fantastic Beasts movies. X-Men. This is before Disney bought Fox. The X-Men had their movies were coming back too with uh, the prequel movies per se. So yeah, it was just kind of a time where there's these franchise revivals and cinematic universes, and it was a big thing. Like there was a lot riding on this movie. It was an expensive movie to make, and there's a lot going into this. It was going to set up everything, and then when people saw it, and it wasn't the most like crowd pleasing kind of movie. It's a very deep, philosophical, complex movie, and I think it kind of caught a lot of people by surprise. Maybe partially because of the trailers. I don't know, but I think it wasn't exactly like Marvel was so predominant in that time period that like that was the conversation at that time, and so was Star Wars. These crowd pleasing kind of movies that when you have a movie like this, it really was kind of like an indie film.
Plus, when you see a person who, like when the General Zod attacked New York and he was largely injured because a building fell on him and he lost the ability to walk, and he just blows himself up in one of like the U.S. Capitol buildings, and they have that in a superhero movie that you're watching, and you're like, what did I just like? You have to sit and kind of process the reality of it, which I don't think a lot of people are necessarily there for. And I would blame Marvel for that, because Marvel creates the more fun, jokey, it's a good, I love watching the Marvel movies, but that has largely consumed our culture. It's resonated more with a lot more people because people feel like they can be more family friendly in it. And the DC stuff, but I like the dark stuff. I like it when they bring that sense of realism to it.
Oh, I agree. I definitely agree. Yeah. Um, so then, obviously when Batman v Superman comes out, it's not met with a lot of praise from fans or critics per se. I mean, some fans really loved the movie when it came out, but a lot of people really didn't like it. It was not, it kind of went against the norm more so than Man of Steel. So then obviously the studio sees that, and Suicide Squad comes out in a couple months. And right when BVS came out, literally a couple weeks later, they start shooting Justice League. So they're like, what do we do? We already have all the sets made and the scripts ready to go. What do we do? And they kind of panic and they decide we're going to have a movie trailer company re-edit the entire Suicide Squad movie to make it more kid friendly. And they change certain details and aspects of the movie as well to kind of not be so in line with Batman v Superman. Deadpool, I think, coming out at that same time had an impact too because that was, it was R-rated, it was dark, but it was comedy, and it was super super successful. And well, I think it's a really good movie, so that's why. But I think that was a big part of it too. And they're like, oh, right now all these comedy and lighthearted movies are really popular. We need to shift our tone. So then obviously they make certain changes to Justice League early on. It's minor changes, um, certain story details and stuff. But and so they redo Suicide Squad. Wonder Woman was like the diamond in the rough. How that movie turned out, as amazing as it was, is so awesome because in a time when there's so much influx with DC, that Wonder Woman movie coming out and it was so good. Gal Gadot was awesome, and everybody just rocked in that movie. Chris Pine was an excellent addition to that movie. But then obviously with Justice League, Zack Snyder's daughter took her life, tragically. And so he steps away from Justice League. And then what happened with Justice League was Joss Whedon came in, and Jeff Johns was also a part of this too. And they were looking to lighten it up even more. And they totally like retooled and rechanged and reshot so much of that movie that it didn't resemble Zack Snyder's work hardly at all. So that's why a lot of people were calling for the Snyder Cut of Justice League.
How much of the hate that gets put on Zack Snyder should really be put on kind of DC Studios more? Because it seems like a lot of things that people are kind of associating as problems with the DC franchise isn't really DC, or no, it isn't really, or yeah, it isn't really Zack Snyder. It's DC specifically they're having a problem with. They're upset with Zack Snyder's movies, which can why it could be associated to him. But it's only because of the fact that there's so much going on with DC. Like they tried during a Batman versus Superman, they kept setting back an R rating for him. And he was like, why are you doing that? I'm editing this to make sure it fits within the guidelines so you can put it out as PG-13. And they were like, well, to be honest, we just don't like a Batman going against Superman. And he was like, well, that's the whole movie. Like, you can't just tell me you don't like it when I already have this, like, this is the whole plot and everything to the movie. So I'm curious if it's really the studio's fault that people should be blaming and not necessarily the hate towards Zack Snyder.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's a really good point. That was a really crazy. When I first heard that, I couldn't believe that either. That the ratings would actually like just and the reasoning behind it is the part that's baffling. You know, like it almost seems so biased.
Yeah.
You know, like what are your standards? What is your reasoning behind it? You know, obviously, like if it's like more than one F bomb, too much blood, obviously those are telltale signs of moving into an R rating. Yeah, that theatrical version didn't have that, so it was just strange that they would keep coming back with that and forcing these cuts. And obviously, with that movie, when it came out theatrically, it was 2.5 hours. The Ultimate Edition, the director's cut version of that movie, the movie that Zack had said was going to be released until like a couple months before it came out, was the 3 hour version. The movie that makes a lot more sense story wise when you watch it. So that's really unfortunate too that that keeps happening to Zack.
What about the Zack Snyder cuts? Did you find that a lot of people that were rejecting anything Zack Snyder created when they actually watched his full take of what he envisioned for the movie rather than what was cut down, that people actually kind of turned were like, oh, this is actually a really good movie when it was actually the full image of what he was trying to show?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is a big part of it. I think a lot of people, changed their tune, I think, when they watched the director's cut of Watchmen, when they watched there isn't a director's cut of Man of Steel, but there's obviously the director's cut, the Ultimate Edition of Batman v Superman. When they saw that, they're like, oh, yeah, this is quite a bit different. There's a lot that was cut out of this movie that helps it make a lot more sense. Sure, they might still have certain issues with how certain characters were depicted, like for example, Doomsday or Lex Luthor. So I mean, those are probably the two biggest ones I would say from that. Obviously, the Martha moment.
Yeah.
It's still in both
I
versions.
like that. I really like that, to be honest with you.
I'm just so shocked that people have such an issue with it, that they just seem so offended by it. And I don't understand it either. I thought it was really interesting. It made sense to me the first time I watched it.
I wasn't expecting it, to be honest. I know a couple people are like, I know what he's going to say. I'm like, I don't even know. But then once it popped up, I was like, you know what? That's it. That is an interesting take to put in there. I mean, it's not something that's going to make me like walk out of the theater at all. I just thought that was like, oh, that's pretty cool that they put that in there.
Yeah, exactly.
How much did you have to learn about Zack Snyder for you to really get a better grasp of the movie? Like, how would you explain to people that the important part of like him losing his daughter is a big factor into understanding what he was going through during the process of just Justice League? And then if you examine things like what he had to go through production wise, people trying to edit his films and trying to change his vision a little bit, I feel like once you kind of understand the background of him, you kind of have a bigger respect for the movies that you're watching.
Yeah, and a lot of this is stuff that you don't normally hear about with a lot of movies because it's kind of kept, you know, under the radar. They kind of keep it private per se. But with a lot of this stuff, it becomes so public, like obviously Zach loses his daughter, right? That's very tragic for anybody, you know? And then to watch the movie that you've been working so hard, spent so many, spent at that point probably years working on, to have it just totally dismantled and have it turned into something totally like for children, you know, and totally not at all what they had spent so much time working towards, and just kind of tearing apart something that he, obviously had put so much love and care into, right? I mean, he cast all the characters. He was kind of the architect behind everything, and that was kind of what everything was building towards. The previous two movies, everything was building towards his cut of Justice League, and then to watch, obviously, like there's stories that have come out like, yeah, they had a 2 hour mandate for the theatrical Justice League before Zack had stepped away, and Zack was like, well, you want more heart and all that stuff in the movie, but if you make me cut it to 2 hours, you're going to be cutting a lot of that too, so he, famously has his director's cut was it 3.5 hours, I think technically was his cut of Justice League. And then obviously um when the fan movement released a Snyder cut came out, and kind of was making this big push towards his cut of the movie getting released, and then it happened, right? There was a lot of pressure for it. A lot of fans and a lot of people in Hollywood were also like, yeah, like he deserves this. Like this is, you know, and hearing some of the differences with how different his cut of the movie was, I think people, I think once they learn about that part of what happened, I think that makes a big part of it too. And then when you see his cut of the movie, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, it's 4 hours long, but because that was partially because it was supposed to be released in those separate chapters. Like they were supposed to be released in like almost like TV episodes per se. But then there was like some legal issues and how with the contracts, and they were the contracts were like they were supposed, like it was to be filmed as a movie initially. Those are what the contracts were signed for, so they couldn't technically release it as episodes. So that's why it's all in one 4 hour cut of the movie. But yeah, I think that makes a big role. Like when you see, how when you learn about Zack Snyder and you see more of his filmography and learn about some of these things that have happened to him um in the past, and then Justice League is probably the most extreme example because it was something that is on a personal level and on a professional level, just how much it impacted, him especially, and to see him finally get that closure and do Justice League his way was just, it was so awesome and so rewarding. And I think it makes a big impact when you learn more about Zack, and you start seeing it more of his other movies, and you, like for example, like Sucker Punch, he still wants to release his director's cut of that movie. There's two versions of that movie already out there, but when you see some of the differences in the different versions of the movie, I think you realize that, the story he's trying to tell. You think like the studio would be like, they're the ones who are agreeing to do this. You think like, I don't know where the disconnect comes from, you know?
Why do you think there was such kind of hesitation with the studios? Not only on the concept of like the Batman versus Superman example, but just when it came to like, they're obviously looking at a market. They're taking polls and seeing what their viewer audience wants to see. But do people really know what they want, to be 100% honest? We really don't. We don't know it until after we see something. We're like, oh my God, that was actually better than expected. But I feel like that contributed largely to Zack Snyder's hate in a way, only because they were more focused with like, you can't do this and you can't do that. Our audience says that this is what they want to see. I'm like, well, I think we've all learned in the past probably 5 years or so that everything's becoming more dark now. And a lot of people really love it. Joker was a fantastic film, only because it was like it was real. It was finally in there. Before, all we got was, like Adam West comedy style superheroes that had the sound effects that would pop up on board. And Zach really changed the game with it. But how much do you think the studio or was more focused into the audience rather than looking at Zack Snyder?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is like, I think you're right. I think that is a big part of it. And I think, with Zack, it's kind of like, and any filmmaker, you know, they're trying to tell a story, right? Every filmmaker is going to have a different way of telling a story. There's different tone to it. And I think part of it is that Marvel, they had one cohesive universe. Everything was, for better or worse, going to have the same kind of tone because everything was supposed to blend together, match together. So that way you have an audience expectation. And I think what sometimes happens is like, I personally love darker movies too. Like you mentioned Joker, that's a great example. The Batman, another great example of a good movie, right? Of a darker movie, in its own, and they're both in their own universes. They're both their own movies, right? And I think part of it is like, I like seeing some variety in the genre, because I think those were desperately needed movies. I mean, you look at all the other movies we've been getting, I think I mean, you look across Disney, Star Wars, you look at Marvel, you look at a lot of the recent DC movies outside of those examples, I think they all kind of feel the same. I mean, look at The Flash, you know, what is that movie? Like
I liked
what?
it. I did. I liked it. I thought it was funny when he started running backwards to show he was going back. I thought that was fucking hilarious.
Yeah, there's parts that I really like in The Flash, and then there's parts that really baffle me because it's just it doesn't seem very coherent. It doesn't seem like I don't know if it knew what it wanted to be in a lot of sense. You know, like the scene with Ben Affleck as Bruce Wayne talking to Barry was a great scene. You know, I think the scene with Barry talking to his mom near the end was an amazing scene. You know,
I
there's some
think
great moments.
they filmed it weird. Whatever the camera style is they used on it made it seem a little bit more. I don't know. The suit stood out a little too much. And then I think everyone in the first maybe 5 minutes of the movie, when the building's collapsing and there's a bunch of babies, spoiler alert, falling out of a window, even I was in my chair like, no, that's making me cringe a little bit. I can only picture what some person who actually has kids would be feeling right now.
Yeah, yeah. There's strange things happen in that movie. It's pretty crazy, but yeah. I mean, a lot of those movies just kind of they don't feel like they have the same kind of love and care put into them and the amount of detail and the amount of respect, I guess, in a lot of ways. And it's not so much the filmmaker's fault. I feel like a lot of it does come back to Warner Brothers. It comes back to, people running DC, and whoever that may have been it's crazy because, Warner Brothers has been sold multiple times in the last, 10 years. They've been sold multiple times and have multiple people running the show in terms of these movies, and they can't seem to it almost seems like it gets worse with each iteration with who's running things. And now we have movies that are already shot and filmed and they're getting shelved forever for a tax break. I mean, what's going on,
Yeah. What would you say? I mean, just from studying and looking kind of a little bit deeper at films, I mean, even just as a fan perspective, but do you think it's just because a lot of these studios have an old style of thinking still, a way that has always made them money, and they've really not bothered to branch? I mean, they're doing it more now with more of the edgier stuff. I think directors like, and I know there's a conflict between James Gunn fans and some Zack Snyder fans, which we can get into if you want at some point, but there are the directors that are really kind of bursting through, I would say, the roof a little bit when it comes to just being one standing voice or an exceptional director and standing above necessarily the studios. Or people aren't going, that's a Marvel film. They're going, no, that's a Zack Snyder film or that's a James Gunn film, which I think is important. But I also don't think it's easy for them to do that because of the fact these produced or production companies, Warner Brothers, Disney, they have a model that works and has always worked for them. So they're not really worried about changing it. They know what they're going to make and they know what this is what's going to happen. But when you have a creative voice like Zack Snyder or someone else, they don't necessarily give them the time and the effort to be able to put in the means to create their image.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of unfortunate sometimes because it just seems like it's all based on money. It's all based on profit. It's all, and I get it. It's a business. I understand, but I think there's almost too much effort being put into, like, the analytics show and the test screening show that we need more of this or more of that. That's what really killed Suicide Squad was the test screenings. They didn't do that with Batman v Superman. They let the movie be what it was. And I think it's aged like a fine wine. I think it's aged really well over time. And I think it becomes more relevant when you look at some of the things that are happening in the world today. But you look at Suicide Squad and to see what happened in that movie and how, the test screening showed that, yeah, the people who watched these liked, the the was it Trailer Park, I think was the ones who they were the ones who uh did like the trailer or whatever. And so like they re-edited the movie to be a lot more poppy and colorful and fun per se, as opposed to David Ayers, more had a lot more drama, a lot more layered. He described it more as a Nolan film. And so like because of that, they went towards the other version of the movie. And I think a lot of times they go towards, I think they're just afraid of upsetting people sometimes. And that's why they jump ship and are like, all right, we're gonna completely change everything what we're doing, and we're gonna have all new movies coming out. All right, we're gonna change all that and do all new movies again. And I think a lot of times it is unfortunate because it's all about how can we make the most money off of something. Our analytics show that X, Y, Z, so we need to do this differently or we need to change this. When in actuality, I think they need to be, instead of being so one-sided where like this is the money and this is like the filmmaker and the art aspect of it as a piece of art, they need to be on the same level. And I think when you work together like that, that's what's really going to help. They're going to help. Both sides are going to help, and I think that's going to just work together, and they're going to get to the next level.
They must
Honestly,
be getting their who test people from people who study the sales of toys or something. Because it seems like when they create their movies, they're specifically targeting like kids, or they're trying to really target like as their audience is going to be kids. But I think we know now that everyone's interested in superheroes. It's a giant part of our culture. I see more guys wearing Captain America shirts than I do little kids wearing Captain America shirts. So I think for them, they've just focused too much on what their toy sales are going to be, what's going to be their merchandise sales of this superhero movie or whatever movie they create. But I'm like, look, I think they just got to branch out of that. But when the fans took to social media, how big of an importance was social media to the rise of Zack Snyder?
huge, huge. I mean, when you look at the fandom, that is a huge part of it because what with when you look at when you see a movie come out that you're so excited about and you can't wait to see like Batman v Superman, even Man of Steel, maybe I would say more so with Batman v Superman, because social media was, I think a little bit, I wouldn't say in its infancy, but it became a lot bigger deal by the time Batman v Superman came around. And I think that, with what was writing on this movie, and then you see, and you let's say you really like that movie, right? And then you see so many critics just and not just say the critics didn't just say that they didn't like the movie. They were like, they hated this movie. And they were gonna let you know why and how awful Zack Snyder is as a filmmaker. And he must hate his mother because of that scene, the Martha scene, right? And it almost felt like a tax, and it's crazy. There's this wonderful podcaster named Rebecca Johnson, for Supergirl Radio, who actually goes through and dissects each individual critic review for Batman v Superman and what they're saying, right? And it's almost like the negatives for them were so negative that they just had to just rant about it. And I think you look at the Rotten Tomatoes score and how that was so low, like 28 or 29%, right? And so a lot of people are saying, "Oh, well, must not be good. I'm not going to watch it." Right? And then all of a sudden, like that, there's this huge drop off.
Norbit has a 3% on there. Norbit is a great movie if you've ever seen that with Eddie Murphy. He plays like every single person in the movie, basically.
Yeah, I know, and that's and I mean, Sharknado should not have a higher,
I don't get it, dude.
like Thor: Love and Thunder has a much higher critic rating. So I mean, I don't understand it. Right? Honestly, people just make your own decisions, right? I mean, make your own judgments on what you want to see and what you like and what you don't like, right? But social media, to get back to what you're saying, social media is a huge part because they felt like they had to defend Zack because of some of these things and what some of like YouTubers and influencers and people were saying about the movie and how it's so dark and dour and like Superman is just crying in the rain for 2 hours. That was actually a Twitter bot thing that was like going at the time when that movie came out. But yeah, so I mean, it was a big deal. And then when you see what happened with Zack, and Zack he's so authentic, and he's such an amazing person. And everybody who's worked with him will say the same thing, that they all stand up for him and they love working with him. They'll drop what they're doing to work with him. And everybody wants to work with him too. And when you see what happened, obviously with Justice League, I think with social media was a huge part because all of a sudden there's these trending events like hashtag release the Snyder Cut was, one of the most famous hashtags ever, right? And how that, I mean, the numbers were staggering, and I think the momentum that was gaining behind that movie, and then also I think a lot of like fans were getting motivated by the fact that there was so much buzz from like people who were like in the media and even from Warner Brothers at the time were like, it doesn't exist. The Snyder Cut doesn't exist, right? But people who worked on the movie said it exists, right? And Zack didn't explicitly say it existed, but he basically was, and he was teasing it, and he kept dropping certain things from his cut of the movie And Zack has never seen the theatrical Justice League. Nolan, Chris Nolan, told Zack's wife, Deborah Snyder, like, you can't let him see that version of the movie when it came out. So Zack hasn't seen it, but yeah, I think when you see like people telling you it doesn't exist, but like people in the know who know say it exists. Kevin Smith has friends who worked on the movie. He's like, yeah, it exists. The long version, like the longer version of the movie, might not be 100% done, but like it's real, like it exists. And then so I think that motivates people to like, to see what happened to Zack, and then to see like this like um how people are just so against that movie. Like we can't even admit it exists because we can't give them the light of day that we can't. It would set a dangerous precedent, which I don't know what that dangerous precedent would be anyway. It's one movie. It's it's not. I don't know what kind of. I mean, what's the dangerous precedent? Having a director release their vision of a movie, a
I think
director's cut.
I think what
Like
they're afraid of is that the fact that now with every movie, even movies that Zack Snyder's not necessarily involved in, they're asking for a Snyder cut version, which is like, does that mean that we have to redo it in the way that this guy wants it to be? The studios always want to be in charge. Like, I honestly think after the Snyder Cut was released, that pissed off a lot of people in that certain industry. Where I mean, I don't know if Zack Snyder, I've heard him talk saying about making films and stuff, but is largely, I mean, he would be not necessarily blackballed, but he would kind of be put on this like no fly list with certain figures that are involved in the top realms of the industry, at least. Just because, hey, I mean, they wanted to keep that on quiet if they could, that there was this Snyder cut. And then you have all these people taking to social media, dropping little hints as a fun and game thing. But then fans got it released. Well, if the industry didn't talk about it or didn't really want it talked about, that's a problem because now they release something and now more people are going to expect, like Aquaman, for instance. Can we see a Snyder cut version of Aquaman? Well, he didn't direct it, and there's probably not a Snyder cut version, but can we get him to make Aquaman? I'm guessing it's because Justice League, if that's his Zack Snyder's vision, you have the people he casted, and then you have these people being put in their own separate films. The Flash being part of the Snyderverse is because it is Ben Affleck Batman in the Flash movie, which would be like, that's a Snyderverse thing then, because that's the Snyderverse created Batman. That's the Ben Affleck. He casted him. He did all this type stuff. I'm guessing. I'm just going back to the initial question because I think I understand it now.
yeah, yeah, it can be complicated and complex to dissect, yeah, but that's a big part of it, yeah, like the Snyder cut of these other movies, yeah. But part of it too is like, if you're a studio executive, they're the ones who greenlit the movie to get made. They knew that, like, hey, maybe this isn't the most, appropriate movie for a 5-year-old to watch, right? But it's more geared towards like teenagers and adults, right? Uh, they're the ones who greenlit the movie to get made. They're the ones who look at the script and say and give it the okay, right? And all of a sudden, last minute, a lot of these things keep happening, and they keep tinkering and meddling and doing whatnot. And then I think, like you mentioned, like when you see what happened when the Snyder Cut got released, a lot of people were upset, yeah, because in a way it kind of exposed some of the horrible decisions that were made, and people are now understanding like, wow, when you watch the theatrical Justice League and then you watch Zack Snyder's Justice League, I mean, they're two. I mean, if you look at like how they took Zack Snyder's Justice League and kind of somehow came up with the theatrical Justice League, it's like, how did you make a mistake so huge like that? It exposes some of that stuff too, and I don't think they wanted that out there. But so I think that's part of it too, like you mentioned, like it did make a lot of people upset because I mean, it obviously didn't bode well for Joss Whedon. It didn't bode well for Jeff Johns. And obviously everything with the Ray Fisher situation kind of took that to another level as well.
Do you think social media, with the fans and everything really taking to social media, it really showed that we had a voice as just people being involved in what movies we'd want to watch? I mean, what are your thoughts on the fact? I mean, the fact that it seemed like before we just kind of waited for them to shovel something in front of us and we just got ready to watch it. But seeing a bunch of people really rise up and defend a director and really want something released, it really shows that we have an impact in what movies they're going to be creating and what movies they're going to be at least distributing to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think on one hand, yes, I think that is really cool that there is that aspect as well, that they can see like what we're interested in. And hey, if we like something, and we want more, and you promised more, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we got more, right? But at the same time, though, when everybody has a voice, I think it sometimes makes it tough because then the critics of a movie or someone doesn't like a movie, they can really make it a somewhat toxic environment. Or if somebody feels wronged, like, hey, I love this movie, but everyone tells me I should hate it. I think sometimes you get some of that, and there's a whole toxic part of fandom, but that's a part of every fandom. Like that's not just pretend like it's only a Zack Snyder fandom thing. I mean, Star Wars has definitely had that. There were death threats to certain actors from those movies. Look at Marvel. Same thing with, and um, you look at how fans react to some of the castings of characters or how they're depicted, and some of the ways that they express, their disdain for, like The Last Jedi, for example. I think that as a bit it sometimes it goes both ways, like there's positives, yes, where I mean look at how we do like these fan driven events where we're just sharing our love, and a lot of us, the people who actually are a big part of this fandom, share a lot of the reasons why we love a movie, right? And we love talking about why we like a certain movie, and I think that makes a really fun, great discussion, right? And I think when I mean you look at the other side of it too, you can have a lot of dissension as well. So it's tough. It goes both ways, but when everyone has a voice, I think it's so different from what it used to be back in the day.
How would you describe at least superhero films to someone who is just interested in watching them, but also likes looking at the reviews? Obviously, you're going to come up with, like, if we take Zack Snyder, you're going to come up with a lot of positives. You're going to come up with a lot of negative reviews. And I think I mean, from maybe my perspective, is it's really hard to handle a topic when it's kind of like dealing with a sacred cow. I mean, for Superman and Batman, these are figures that people wore their pajamas when they were little and had like severe memories and experiences watching these either cartoons or films. So you kind of have to look at that when you look at the criticism of Zack Snyder and the positives of Zack Snyder. It's like depending on who's saying what, you really have to examine the experience. And this is obviously one of those subjects, especially superheroes, as much as it affects our society now. It's just a sacred cow. It's like talking about someone as like it's technically like a religion in some people's eyes, you know?
That's true. Yeah, I mean that is an interesting point. Yeah, how um yeah, how they're viewed in such a light. People have such a adoration and love for these characters. It is kind of like a religion to a lot of people. And because of that, I think that's where a lot of, some of the, if you are a huge fan of the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, right? If you're a big fan of the Michael Keaton Batman movies, yeah, yeah. And then, for some of those people, like those are the version of the characters that they grew up with, that they love, right? Then all of a sudden you watch a movie that has these two characters in it, you would think that you'd be like so excited for it. And then when you see the movie and it's a darker version. It's not exactly, these characters sometimes are put in positions where they do things that kind of go against what they're known for. And and of course then they rise above it in the end, but they don't like seeing that. It's not what they grew up with. And so of course, like, you know, they say Henry Cavill is never happy as Superman and he's not the joyous kind of character, but then he's also in modern situations, he's put in more difficult situations that reflect our world today, and that in ways that weren't present in previous versions of the movie and those movies. So I think it is really interesting to think about, like it's hard because, those kind of people are going to have really extreme, if they have extreme passion for it, they're either going to, if they love one version of the movie and then there's a version and there's a different movie with that character that's so different, it's hard for some of those people to kind of get over that. Maybe I'll be the same way too. Maybe, James Gunn's Superman will come out and I'll be like, oh, what is this? We should have got that Henry Cavill Superman movie.
What they need is a Snyder cut version of the George Clooney Batman. That'd be fantastic.
George Clooney Batman, yeah.
Everyone hates that version. I saw it when I was so little. Maybe I'd have to rewatch it again, but I didn't think it was that bad. I mean, I wouldn't put it up there to par with any of the other ones that we got, but I didn't think it was like enough to be like, this is the worst, and we're just never going to talk about it.
Look, I watched Batman Forever and Batman and Robin so much as a kid. Like I watched them so much.
Poison
So
Ivy
I,
was
I
hot. I've never seen her in like anything else besides that movie.
Yeah, yeah, and then you had Arnold Schwarzenegger as all his ice puns, and oh yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying. Yeah, so
I didn't like
um,
Michael Keaton's Batman until I saw The Flash. And then it was once he started talking, they kind of introduced him, and then he finally got into the Batman suit. I was like, this might be my new favorite Batman. I'm pushing Adam West out. And then when I don't want to spoil it, but when they started killing him over and over and over again, I was like, why? He just became my favorite. And they just keep going back and forth. I'm like, this is terrible.
yeah, I know what you mean. It's interesting that it was because of the Flash that you gained this new appreciation for Michael Keaton's Batman. That's really interesting.
I didn't grow up with seeing any of those. I don't think I've ever saw the Michael Keaton original Batmans. I just saw him in that version, and I like Michael Keaton as an actor. Like I didn't like him in the Spider-Man versions and stuff, but I also think it's because we're the best part about films now is that like when they do the multiverse stuff, they tend to go back and they grab things from the past and then just to get the older generations hooked into the film as well too, probably. But it introduces the people like myself who necessarily didn't grow up around the fandoms and include them into the whole experience. I mean, everyone knows the names Aquaman, Batman, and all these, but we don't necessarily have people devoted as that's our Batman or that's our Superman. Maybe my Batman would be Christian Bale because that's the movies I saw when I was growing up. And then to other people, it would be George Clooney. To other people, it would be, name whoever, Michael Keaton, or that's theirs. But it's this weird thing where we're at now where it's like everyone wants to see their own version. And I think we have the resources to give people their own version of any of these superhero movies. That's why I think Zack Snyder's kind of important because he kind of throws it all into one. He doesn't necessarily go, this is exactly what I want to do. And we know Superman's going to be this loyal and this is never going to happen. He's like, I'm going to try my best to make a good film, but I also want to do it in a way that's going to make you think. Like a lot of those movies have some type of deeper meaning when you really pull back the layer of it.
Yeah, and I honestly credit a lot of that also. I mean, obviously Zach deserves so much credit. I don't deserve anything. Chris Terrio, he deserves so much credit for his work on Batman v Superman and Zack Snyder's Justice League. I think David S. Goyer deserves credit for what he did with Man of Steel. I think those movies are so deep and so philosophical, and they make you challenge your perception of certain things, not just the characters, but and how they reflect our world as well. And I think I mean I love Chris Terrio. He's such an amazing writer. So I think that and it's unfortunate what happened with the Rise of Skywalker, and that was a very difficult situation to be in. But yeah, I think that he deserves a lot of credit as well. The late David Brenner, who passed away, he was the editor for those movies. He deserved a lot of credit as well. And Zach has a really talented team around him. I mean, the cinematography aspect of it. Zach, he shoots his own films now, but which is crazy because he's kind of like he does a lot of different things in his own movies now. But working with uh, cinematographers who are just so incredible, and set photography even as well. I think that Zach just has such an incredible team, set design, you name it, and obviously the cast. I mean, he has a really he surrounded himself with such great talent on those movies, and that's something that I wrote in the book that Kevin Costner was really happy about, was that a lot of times he's like, they invest the money in special effects, but maybe not so much in casting or character or whatever. And he liked that Zach was like, no, like this is what I want. This is what I'm going for. I want, he surrounds himself with people who are helping be successful. And that's the key to being successful in any business, in any trade, and whatever you're doing. Surround yourself with talented people and you'll be surprised how far they'll take you.
Did you follow him when he made 300?
No. In fact, I didn't know who Zack Snyder was until they announced Man of Steel.
Okay. I didn't know he was until Justice League, but then I found out he made 300, and that movie is actually, from what I've heard from people who study Spartan history, it's actually surprisingly very accurate.
Yeah, and of course it's not maybe 100% accurate, like
Yeah.
the very
Like
style.
a lot of people don't know Leonidas was not that young and he was not that ripped. He was actually 60 in his late 60s when he led the Battle of 300.
Yeah. Yeah, so and yeah, it's and 300 was what really put him on the map. I mean, he made Dawn of the Dead before that, but 300 really was a big hit. And revolutionary kind of movie too. Like all like green screen, almost the whole movie. Like that was unheard of. That was before Avatar, and all those kind of movies. But yeah, I mean, I didn't really know Zack until Man of Steel. Man, I grew up a big fan of Superman and Batman, so I definitely, like I could relate to what you're saying about, growing up with these characters, the sacred cow per se, right? I love the Christopher Reeve movies. Even Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. I watched that movie a lot as a kid too. Even, Nuclear Man, right? But yeah, I mean, I watched the Batman animated series, Superman the animated series. I watched all the Batman movies we mentioned. I loved the Dark Knight movies. I was a big Superman fan. So, when Man of Steel was announced, of course I was really excited about it. It had been a while since we had a Superman movie, and then how they re-envisioned this character. Of course, at the time I was a really big Smallville guy. I still
Okay.
am. I
All
still
right.
am.
I
But
liked it. It was a good show.
yeah, I really enjoy Smallville. Uh, great show. But yeah, so I mean, I was at the time I was like, well, that is kind of isn't that our Superman? But when I started, when you see a trailer for a movie, right, and you start seeing who's in the movie, like the cast of the movie, how they kind of reinvented Superman for a new generation. That was when I first knew Zack Snyder. And then once I was like, okay, now I need to go back and watch his other stuff. So then I went back and I watched Watchmen and 300, and whatnot. So I kind of familiarized myself with who he was. I'd never heard of Henry Cavill. So I went and I watched, I think it was Immortals he was in. Stuff like that. And that's kind of where that started. And then, of course, I mean, that movie just, Man of Steel really was what kind of, because before that, I wasn't like super well versed in how in like Hollywood. And I mean, I like movies, but I wasn't really like super invested in like how it worked and the details and everything about it, I guess, until that movie. And there was a gentleman named John Schnepp who talked a lot about like nerd fandom and talked a lot about the movies and stuff because he worked in the business. Like he worked on a show called Metalocalypse, and at the time he was doing a show called Movie Talk on YouTube, and would kind of, I mean, it was fun, but it was kind of like that's what really got me into like it's okay to be a nerd. Like I was an athlete before that, but like like it's okay to be a nerd. It's fun to explore this kind of stuff, and I've been a huge nerd ever since.
I wouldn't necessarily call it, I think being a nerd's cooler now, but it seemed like once superhero became part of like the actual culture a lot more and more people were open about talking about it, you realize that everybody has comics or everyone has looked at a comic or everyone enjoys the fascination with superheroes, especially when it became grittier too. I think it became cooler when it became more gritty. Like there was the Dark Knight really kind of shook a lot of people up. I remember my dad in the theater when he took me there to go see it. That was the first time I ever hear him go, "Holy shit!" Like just out in the whole theater. I was like, "All right, I know he's hooked." He's like, "First 5 minutes, bank robbery scene. Are you kidding me?" I'm like, "All right, okay." He's happy with it. And I just think that was with a lot of people because before it was cool to watch if you had kids and stuff like that, or you were a kid and you kind of, but the nerd culture thing, I don't know. I think everyone's an inner nerd. They just hide it.
That's so true. That's so true. And I think nowadays, like you said, it's a lot more balanced. It's not so like stereotyped, because I mean, I grew up a sports nut, like I was, I memorized all the batting averages of all the, I've always lived in Minnesota, so I've always been, I was a Twins fan as a kid. So like I knew every player and I was a nerd about sports as a kid. And then as I got older, I mean, I was always a fan of like Superman and Batman and whatnot. I didn't really know much about Marvel until the Marvel movies, but I grew up a big Star Wars fan too. So, when you get older and you're still able to embrace that side of yourself, I think that's, really cool to have a more balanced, nuanced kind of approach.
Now with Smallville, I think it was important because the fact they kind of focused a lot on his high school and like the life a little bit about being what it's like being in high school and having these powers and trying to keep them concealed. Because we just see in most movies, Superman's just Superman. And he has this split identity, but you never really focus on the earlier years. It's why I like Gotham so much. If you've ever seen that show about like the Batman, like his start and as he goes through his childhood a little bit, but it focuses more on Detective Gordon and the characters that surround Batman are just involved in Gotham, where you start getting a bigger appreciation for the superhero himself. And it's like, it's not even necessarily focused on him as much. It's more just the backstories of everybody else.
Yeah, that's a good point. I I could never really got into Gotham. It's just so weird. It's so weird. It doesn't make any sense, right? Like I was a huge Smallville fan. But like and it's weird because like just like when I was growing up, I didn't watch it when it was on the air until like right when it finished with their series finale was when I first started watching Smallville. So that's kind of when I first became like a big fan of it, was right when it ended, lucky me. But I think that's part of what, you're able to enjoy stuff nowadays, even, like Talkville and hearing them talk about it. But yeah, like Smallville, I was a big fan of Smallville, but Gotham I just never got into. But you're right, though. I mean, the character study, how you can explore these characters at different ages from what you're used to, like the teenage years, and it was so relatable too. I think was just it added so much cool lore to the Superman mythology. That was awesome.
I want to ask, it's kind of like a final question here, but what did you want your book to kind of show to people? What do you want your reception to be of it? Not like a good applause or bad applause, but what do you want people to really take away from it?
Great question. I think the biggest reason why I wrote the book in the first place and why I stand behind it now is so much is being said about these movies and the making of these movies, and some of it wasn't entirely accurate, or some of it was kind of sure, like they would say what was happening, but there was a twist, like there was injected opinion on certain things, and I felt wasn't fair. And I think people really, the way I laid out the book was, I explained what these movies were trying to be versus what people were expecting them to be. And I laid out all the facts. Yes, I'm a Zack Snyder fan. Yes, I'm a superhero fan, but I laid out everything as a factual kind of thing where there's no bias really. I mean, 99% of the book is just laying out the facts of what happened and why things happened, and letting the reader make up their own opinion on what they like or don't like. And I think that was really important for me to lay a lot of this stuff out and to not be afraid to talk about certain things, right? Like there's a chapter in the book where I talk about the Batman, not the Robert Pattinson version, but the version that was supposed to be the Ben Affleck solo Batman movie, and why that didn't happen. There's a chapter in the book that talks about it's the A over E, it's the Ray Fisher situation, right? And that's a topic that is a very um you could get in a lot of trouble really fast. It could be very easy to um you know, be like, yeah, I mean, to defend Joss Whedon or defend Ray Fisher or whatever. And obviously everybody has an opinion, but it was important to me to leave my opinion out of the book. There might be one or two instances where maybe I did, and there might be a part and when you first learn about Doomsday where I may or may not have left a certain um, opinion in parentheses just because it was I couldn't help myself. But yeah, it's told from a neutral perspective. Um, here's what happened, here's what they were going for, here's a lot of the behind the scenes and what a lot of the people involved said that they were with what the influences were in these movies, and just really trying to explain what these movies were. And I felt like you know Marvel and Disney and Star Wars have such like a hold on like box office, and just like how popular they were and are. But I felt like with the Zack Snyder movies, I felt like they deserved their own light. I deserve like they felt to be they need to be remembered as well. I think they contributed a lot, whether positive or negative, to um the movie experience. So I think that was a big reason why I felt the need to write the book, and I'm happy I did.
Is there a place where people can find any of your links to your book, links to your podcast, and any other social media? I know you have a Twitter page, but any other social medias or websites or anything like that you like to promote?
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, I guess first things first, like if you're looking for the book, it is on Amazon, the Snyderverse Saga, the culture-shattering phenomena behind Zack Snyder's DC film universe. If you type in the Snyderverse Saga, I guarantee you'll be the first thing that'll pop up. There is an ebook, paperback, and hardcover available. If you'd like to check that out, I published it in October of 2021. So obviously, certain things that have happened since then are not in the book, unfortunately. Maybe there will be a second volume someday. Who
There'll be an
knows?
updated copy.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe someday we'll do a Snyder cut version of the book,
I was
you
gonna
know.
say that. Can you do a Snyder cut version of the Snyderverse?
Yeah, right. Wouldn't that be awesome? maybe there'll be like a foreword from Zack Snyder or something. I don't know. We'll
I'll
see.
reach out to him. I'll send him an email.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, so that's where we can find the book. Otherwise, I also started my own company, Oak Valley Media, where I'm going to be publishing more books in the future, and that's kind of where I do my podcast, Round Two, the film sequel. Right now, we have almost 40 episodes, and hope to kind of get back to that later this year. Kind of taking a break. A lot of stuff going on right now. Wife and I are expecting our first kid here very soon.
Congratulations.
So thank you. Yes, we're pretty excited. So we have a lot going on. So hopefully we'll get back to that later in the year. But Oak Valley Media LLC.com is the website to check out all stuff like that. And I also edited I did an edit for a book that's coming out soon too, a fantasy book, which I will definitely promote on there as well.
Well, I'll make sure I link all your links in the description so people can be able to find your work and your podcast. And Daryn, I really appreciate the time you gave me to talk about the Snyderverse and educate me a little bit too about it because man, I heard, like I said, I think most people have heard the name or saw a hashtag about it, but nobody knows really exactly what it was. And I was happy we were able to talk a little bit about it and also a little bit about films as well too, just kind of the different varieties. And thank you everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.